everyone. We just opened the doors, so we'll let everyone filter in on what is a very wet and pretty windy day in the southwest of England, I have to say. I don't know what it's like for the Davids. It's a bit further away from me, but it's a bit grim.
Flew through here about an hour ago, and all the gutters were overflowing, and yeah, it got very wet.
So in true British style, I started talking about the weather before anything else. Anyway, welcome everyone. We're just going to let people arrive for the next few minutes. And if you're looking for Fosway's Ask the Analyst session on our 9 Grids for Talent and People Success, you are in the right place. So, and if you'd like to tell us where in the world you are, then please do so in the chat. Hi, Julian. You're another David, so it could be David overload if it isn't already.
No such thing.
There's no such thing, no.
Yeah, you can never get too much of the Davids, that's for sure.
Yeah, can't have too much of a good thing.
Indeed. So we will try, we will stick to time in actual fact, not try, but people are arriving, so we'll just let you, we'll let some more people arrive. So please get comfortable. And yeah, tell us where you are, if you fancy telling us where you are. We've got three of us in, well, 2 of us in the southwest. Well, I'm in the southwest of England. I think Cirencester, does that count as the southwest? Yeah, okay.
Cotswolds. Oh.
Yeah. And David, where you're more
Cloudy North Hampshire. Here we go. Oh, sorry, I should put rainy North Hampshire. So.
North Hampshire.
Yeah.
So we got
Ooh,
cloudy and sunny Brighton.
Sunny
Washington,
Brighton, not so sunny.
Lad, congratulations.
Yeah.
And Kevin, Dublin, Washington. So we're Claire Marie. Hi, Claire Marie. So we've got a few,
Paris.
a couple of continents covered. Sergio, welcome from Madrid. We'll just give it a few more seconds, and then I think we'll get going. Thanks everyone for coming today. Bedfordshire. Hey Dan, it's good to see the central area of England covered too. West London, Hertfordshire. So I've got a reasonable covering of the English counties here. So welcome everyone. Weybridge. Yeah, I grew up in Surrey, so I'm more familiar with that part of the world actually. I'm in Bath in southwest England. Right, shall we get going? I think we ought to. So let me do the formal welcomes. As you will have seen, this is the Ask the Analyst session for the Fosway 9 Grid for Talent and People Success. For those of you who are new to Fosway, let me just make an introduction to the business. It was founded in 1996 by David Wilson. So we're now in our 26th year. And in that time have been conducting in-depth corporate research on next generation HR talent and learning. And we have also been doing a lot of analyst and advisory work with large multinationals and corporates in Europe and internationally. And we also do a lot of independent vendor research and EMEA market commentary. So today's panel of 2 are, if you haven't met them, they are familiar faces around Fosway Towers. We have our CEO, David Wilson. Welcome, David.
Hi, good morning.
And afternoon in the UK, and our Director of Research and Lead Analyst for Talent and People Success, David Perry. Welcome, David. Now, just a quick overview. We're going to keep to time. We've got until 3 o'clock. This is mostly about questions. So the thing here is please do ask questions or post your comments in chat. My colleague, Jack Smith, is also with us. He's more in the chat. So if you've got any other technical type questions, then please do pop it in there. We will have people representing different vendors, and obviously there's lots of vendors on the grid. So we ask you to play nicely and also say who you represent if you feel like doing that. We're going to have 10 minutes just discussing some of our research process, and then we're going to look at some of the trends in this area, and then we're going to go to questions and aim to finish at 3 o'clock. So I'm hoping that all makes sense for everyone. And without further ado, I will hand you over to David.
Maybe we might finish by 4 o'clock even. Just checking.
Yes. Sorry.
So keep on changing. It's very confusing.
I am confused.
There we go. So thanks. Can I have the next slide, Ian? Thanks very much. So one of the things we normally try and do before we go into actually talking about the 9 grid. So the whole point of these sessions is to give you an opportunity to ask whatever questions you want to ask around them. So that's what the majority of the time is. But just a bit of context, David's going to talk a little bit around some of the trends and some of the things we've seen when we go into it. But I also want to just talk about the process. So again, if you've attended these before, you know it's pretty standard. But I think it's really important that people understand where the 9 grids come from and where the data comes from. So 9 grid, each 9 grid is a pretty monster process for us, and each year continues to get bigger and bigger, really. A new 9 grid typically is 3 or 4 years in the making. Talent and people success is an evolution of one of our older topic areas, which is around talent management and the talent life cycle in general. The data for this comes from many different sources, and in particular, obviously for us, what's very important is the corporate input to it. So from our corporate research network members, roundtable sessions when we run those, corporate inquiry activities, private advisory activity, and so on. So we've got the sort of private corporate conversations. We have then the sort of public research layer as well, including things like our trends research, where we also go ask people what vendors they're using, what they think of them. We also then run a very kind of in-depth process with the vendors themselves, a structured data capture process with hundreds of lines of functionality on them, non-functional factors and core metrics, etc. as well. We do lots of briefings. We do then off the back of that more customer referencing and so on and so on. So it's a pretty huge process. It involves quite a lot of time, the update cycles around each one of these. So although particularly the corporate side of this runs all year round, there's also a 4 to 5 month update window that we go through where we kind of pull a lot of extra things together. Next slide. Yeah, the inclusion criteria. So this is one of the questions we get asked quite a lot, is who gets included and why. So the kind of basic criteria is that we're looking for vendors who are in active use in our target audience, which is typically EMEA headquartered or internationally headquartered corporate organizations, typically medium, large enterprise. So who are they currently using? Who are they actively considering? And the other thing is we also then are trying to also look for innovator companies who are potentially the ones that we see as appearing on that list. So who are the ones with the potential to achieve 1 or 2? Vendors don't get to choose whether they're in a 9 grid. They can choose to participate in an input process, but at the end of the day, the decision as who go on the 9 grid is an analyst decision purely. A vendor can't buy their way on it. They can't buy their way off it. They can't decline to be included. It's literally based on relevance, as I said, to our target audience. As I've said, there's a very extensive input process. The key thing to also understand is that the primary point of view, the primary analysis is shaped by what customers say. So although we do quite a lot of vendor input actually for us is a secondary process and more for cross-validation. So it's a very useful process, obviously, because we can track vendor roadmap and delivery, maybe new modules. Obviously, it's also a very volatile market, so mergers and acquisitions and things like this as well. So the vendor side of the process is really important, but ultimately it's the corporate side of it that really defines the position we have, both in terms of the companies that we see it really serving, and also ultimately the advocacy. So somebody can have a very high market presence, but actually if they've got quite poor advocacy as well, then that may well actually impact their position fairly negatively. So we're always looking for the corporate view first, and that will always be the dominant thing in terms of making the overall assessment. And the overall summary statement there is, we have thousands or tens of thousands of pieces of data, insight, etc. around that. As I said, each year the cycle gets even bigger, with more corporates, more vendors, more briefings, more data capture points, and so on. So there's a lot of assumptions that we're trying to distill together and validate in order to be able to ultimately distill into the N9 grid. And the final thing I wanted to kind of say is that although everybody fixates a little bit around the 9 grid as a diagram, because obviously that's kind of what ultimately is the sort of tip of the iceberg, there's the other thing that goes alongside that, which is the report, is something we'd always recommend everybody reads. So first of all, because each year we rewrite the market and solution trends section, so that those really differ some of the important things, and David's going to touch on those in a second. But also it defines the criteria. So what makes our performance and potential and presence and so on are defined specifically for this segment in the actual 9 grid report itself. So we'd always recommend you download and read those 4 reports to get a sense around it. We also find a lot of organizations actually really pick up and use a lot of information out of the solution trends and the market trend sections as well. So there's definitely worth reading, not just to obviously, to explain what's behind the diagram, but also the way we're looking at the market as well. And on that note, I'm going to kind of pass across to David, just talk a bit about that, lead into the discussion around the specific 9 grid itself.
Yes. This particular one, and I had to look back, and this is our 7th year of looking at the talent and people success marketplace, or what would have been talent management. And back in those days, I didn't have grey hair, so you wouldn't have had so much whiting out because the sun's decided to come out. But in terms of how it fits, it actually fits within a wider HCM, human capital management solution model that we effectively sort of almost separate the HCM solutions a little bit from the talent and people success solutions. We do, when we ask people for feedback from core solutions like Workday and SAP, when they have that HR focus, we ask them all the same questions as we ask people in the talent and people success space, with some additional ones which are also embrace things like organization, workforce, service delivery, and payroll. But what you see in that hexagon model is effectively all of our primary dimensions that we're looking at the market space through. So elements of what's the employee experience, what intelligence layers do you have, what's the quality of integrations, and then very much we're focusing around the recruiting and onboarding, learning and development, career, mobility and marketplace, performance feedback, engagement and well-being, and reward and recognition. And probably some things that are shared typically by both the HCM and the talent and people success model is the thing around skills. That seems to be a bridge between the two systems, an enabler across both areas, and also some elements of people management and organization, but not probably to the level of sophistication of the HCM space. Typically, what we're looking at in our perception of or our view of the market space is also very much that focus on enterprise organizations. So our commentary and our analysis is typically around the enterprise space, typically organizations that are 5,000 employees plus, but there is a little bit of a flexing down for some organizations as well. So that may not necessarily always be the sweet spot for most of the people, for some of the people we put into the grid, but typically most of the people we're talking to are targeting larger organizations as part of their sort of our commentary on the market space. Ian, that's great. One of the things that we sort of basically been thinking about primarily as we look at this space is some of the organizational drivers. And I think when we've looked at this space, we sort of transitioned it away from being labeled talent management into talent and people success, because I think we've come to realize that actually, that given the challenges of that organizations face today, actually around work, their sense of purpose, how they harness their people to get things done, and the innovation that's required to keep pace with the pace of change in organizations and more widely. Actually, you need to start to have an organization that can respond with energy and flexibly to what changes around them. You need a set of talent which can be empowered to enable you to take advantage of opportunities, and you need people who are energized to cope with almost persistent change. And what we've sort of come to do is almost try and sort of put these overlays on of purpose, work, people, and innovation. And where these start to rub together is probably the sorts of things that we're now seeing organizations evolve around their talent and people success strategies. So helping people align themselves to purpose, helping the purpose drive the shape of the work, helping people then be aligned to work and purpose, and then also drive innovation through skills and actually the changing center or opportunities the organization. So innovating around how the organization resources itself and pushes people in particular roles. And it's very much about maybe creating a more democratic, more energized and accelerated flow of people to the work that needs to be done. And I think that probably encapsulates some of the key sort of messaging. We've used this model, which is from inspired by NASA. They talked about missions, we talk about work and things like that. So that's something just to sort of take away as our sort of big picture. And moving on to the next slide, I think what we did probably about 3 years ago, maybe 4 now, is look at the drivers behind the solutions and what people were trying to achieve through their traditional talent management platforms, and really thought, so what would organizations need to do in the future? Or what are they trying to do now, which is innovating and changing their view of that whole approach to people? And we saw this sort of shift away from necessarily just having workforce management as a practice to thinking, actually, how can I move into having a more agile allocation of talent within my organization, moving away from thinking it's just about hiring people, it's just about talent acquisition, and actually it's maybe more to do with how I can flexibly resource my organization using both contingent workers, using people who work for me full time. Maybe it's about using agencies. What's the way that I can resource to get work done? Also moving maybe into that more agile mentality of not just having succession planning of who's going to be stepping into the shoes of people as they move out of the organization or up the organization, but just thinking, so what opportunities are there within the organization that actually we need to get people to be involved in? And that sort of maybe moves you away from having job boards to thinking about not just advertising jobs, but also advertising projects and gigs, moving away from just having roles and responsibilities to thinking about skills and outcomes and the experience that people bring to enable you to execute work. And you can go through all of these items, right? There's loads of these down here, sort of moving away from training to think about how we do more learning through work, moving away from just having appraisals, which are still happening on your basis, but actually thinking about continuous mentoring, moving away from just thinking about equal opportunities to think how we can more proactively include people from particular parts of our organization or particular sets of communities to drive a more inclusive, more equitable, more diverse workforce. So we sort of saw this shift to some extent from what you might call the old foundations into new differentiators, which drive probably better energy in work, more flexibility, and more resilience within organizations. And I think that's probably one of the significant things that's worth restating. We went through this sort of, I suppose, rebranding of talent management into talent and people success 3 years ago. And this is the sort of still putting that up to say, this is the direction that lots of organizations are going to, primarily because it's not just about managing people, it's about enabling people to succeed within the organization. So what that's brought us to is our latest 9 Grid for talent and people success for 2022. The key headlines that we put into the report were very much around thinking about this move away from legacy talent management into disruptive talent, and that continues to outpace what people are buying. They're buying much more into things like talent mobility than they were, say, around succession planning, and that is reflected all the way through most of those modules. Skills and the people experience is actually dominating people's drivers behind what they buy and why they're buying it. And some of the reasons behind that come out of our HR realities research. There's some really interesting stats that, so just to pick one out, 17% think they have an irresistible employee experience, so less than 1 in 5. But people think that skills is the #1 initiative to future-proof their organization. And they also say that actually the biggest challenge is the availability of skills in their organization as well. And that 90% say that actually it's the skills that underpin a great employee experience. So there seems to be this convergence of initiatives and thinking that skills is a real differentiator, both from organizations in their ability to attract, retain their people, but also power a more fluid workforce when actually the availability of skills is quite low. We're also seeing this sense of people intelligence and AI being significant differentiators. If I picked out that sense of people intelligence, is what we know about people to enable us to make sure how we optimize and energize them as individuals around our work to help us retain them and also develop them around the key initiatives that we're interested in. We're also seeing this shift away from just having employee engagement and engagement surveys towards advocacy and culture building. So thinking about not just how can I measure and understand what people's levels of engagement are, but how can I make them true advocates of my organization? How can I energize them and build a culture in an environment where there's maybe a significant amount of remote and flexible working? And what does that mean for the culture of organizations and how they become effective? And just finally to say, probably one of the most significant, I suppose, continuing items of our view of this particular part of the market space is that no solution does it all. And actually, because of that, typically talent and people solutions need to start to play within an ecosystem of solutions, both with core HR, both with learning, but also with a balance between talent mobility, skills, the link out to employee engagement, as well as some of the traditional processes as well. So that's, I suppose, some of the key headlines. David, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add into there. I could have explained the dimensions again. I'm not sure if it's worth us going through that. We've covered this a few times.
Hopefully, yeah. Hopefully most people are kind of pretty aware of those points. I mean, I think the one thing I would add is really just to re-emphasize what David was saying. When we made a big transition around this 3 years or so ago and moved to talk about talent and people success as a much more democratized and disruptive kind of agenda, I think what we've also seen is continual growth in terms of the 9 Grid itself of, you know, the number of disruptor specialists that are coming in and the speed with which some of those are developing and growing. I'm sure we'll come on to some questions around that, but, you know, some of the organizations like Gloat and Eightfold and Phenom and so on, and also the number of mergers and acquisitions, obviously, that's still very, very high in the market, and also around mergers and acquisitions around skills, around AI, etc. As everybody's trying to really has been trying to accelerate their whole offering set. I think what we've also tried to do this year is also go hunting and look for some of the other, you know, second-tier players that really have a potential to really be more disruptive in the market going forward as well, rather than just looking at all the big names. So I think, you know, there's a lot of change actually this year in terms of it. It's still really dominated by specialists, I would say, in the overall position, and we continue to see the market growing fast and evolving very strongly, even despite, you know, the transition into maybe a semi-recessionary or recessionary climate. So I suggest, Martin, what we do is we head over and maybe go into some questions.
Yeah, great. Well, we've had our first question from Paul, so let's start there. skills seem to be the word of the year, but is this really anything new? Any difference from competencies? Who wants to go with that?
I'll happily jump in. I think fundamentally, whether you call it competencies or capabilities, to some extent, the principle or the label is maybe slightly nuanced or slightly different, but it's not anything fundamentally new. I think what is significantly changed is the technology that now enables individuals and organizations to understand what skills are available within the organization and create the connection, both between the future direction of the organization, maybe in terms of its workforce planning and its people, but also to the roles that are evolving and the work that needs to be done to people, and also then the links between the gaps that organizations can see in their people and this ability to fulfill its strategic goals and the learning that would help people develop those skills as well. So I think it's probably not necessarily a change in the phraseology too much. I think it probably means the same thing, but I think it's been a significant evolution in the way that technology can support that, both through things like skills inference, building skills graphs, and all the mapping and the connections that happen thereafter.
Yeah, the thing I would add to that is that I think we can get into a definition battle around, competencies versus capabilities versus skills. And in some ways, it's not particularly helpful. I think the key thing to understand around skills is that we're really looking at skills across the whole organization, rather than most organizations, when they ended up really focusing on the competencies piece, tended to focus on a very limited subset of areas. And secondly, I think skills is a much wider issue than L&D. There's a massive land grab for skills across the whole HR ecosystem, from recruiting, from talent, from HR, and from L&D. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that companies have, is they almost have a multiplicity of view of what their skills might be, and they're trying to work out how to, who has the best view, who maybe has the best AI and machine learning, and how to join them up. We have a slide that we shows which talks about how skills fits in the ecosystem, and most large corporates bite a hand off to actually get some clarity around where this thing needs to live. The other comment I would make is that I think the C-suite gets the skills problem, right? So they understand it, but when they talk about it, they talk about skills, what I call skills with a capital S. So that means skilled and effective people, as opposed to skills with a small s, maybe meaning, I don't know, Java programming or critical thinking, or kind of much more granular things. So I think the board, the C-suite gets the story around, we can't hire enough skilled people. How do we retain them? How do we reskill and upskill our organization to realign it to the business that we're now in, let alone the business we're trying to go to? That conversation is much more strategic than it ever was under a competencies type discussion. But the challenge is building, being able to create an architecture that connects all the dots together and ultimately delivers real value. We've also, as David kind of implied, we've been around this loop multiple times in the past and often ended up binning it because it didn't really deliver business value. It was more of an HR or L&D project. So I think that's still one of the critical measures of success, is this is delivering business value.
And just to add to that, I think if you use the combination of skills and intelligence, then the world has changed significantly, even in the last 6 years. You have providers, almost neutral providers like Lightcast, who have vast inventories of skills which they can now assess yourself against, and also your competitor base against. So that sort of level of skills intelligence, both in terms of where you are as an organization and where you may want to be, especially through the lens of what your competitors are up to with their skills, is something that actually is, I think, a really interesting part of the insight that you probably would never have had before.
Yeah, can I just pick up on that, David, because we've had a question, Sergio, I'll come to your question in a sec, but Michael also has asked a question, and I would just ask everyone if you could put the question in to everyone rather than to the hosts and panelists, so that then everyone can see your question. I mean, just picking up on that, he's asking, when it comes to skills data, how are you seeing vendors evolving, and what needs aren't being met yet in the skills market? So you kind of started to touch on that. Is there anything else? Where's this going? And
yeah, I think in terms of the advances that have been made around skills, most of that has come primarily from organizations that have had their hands on the most data that you could probably link to skills, which has come from talent acquisition. So lots of the people who've got the most data in terms of profiling individuals, getting a sense of how well they matched to even sort of live roles within an organization, has historically come from that talent acquisition space. And I think that the story pretty crudely has been that the millions of applications that they processed across all sectors has eventually turned from being an outside view of this is the talent pool which you might want to engage with and encourage to work for you, to being actually we can focus this technology internally and think about how we enable the unknown talent within your organization to surface. So I think that's been almost one of the sort of key things. So lots of the, I suppose, the main players in this space tend to have a little bit more of a talent acquisition heritage, unless they've approached this as a pure skills play. But even then, they've had to process millions of data points in order to get some good AI and good machine learning going. So it tends to have that more maybe external view. And I think that's probably one of the most significant things to some extent.
I think the other thing is the HCM players have also made a bit of a land grab, as I said, for this as well. So, I mean, Workday probably led the way with Skills Cloud, but, Oracle and SAP are also doing that, doing the same thing. I mean, the big talent suites like a Cornerstone, etc., are also very focused on it. And some of this is through acquisition and some of it's through, organic development. And I think it's partly because obviously the skills question sort of underpins the entire employee life cycle, from who do we want to hire and why should, who are the right candidates, through to, how do we retain, how do we develop them? I think one of the interesting things probably in this, if we're looking at it strategically, is that probably one of the other big obvious part of this to own more of the problem would be L&D. And the learning systems, and in reality, they're not lead players in this conversation, which is a kind of so if you're actually on this coming from more of an L&D background, that's one of the challenges, I think, is really stepping up that conversation, because ultimately for most organization it comes down to a build or buy conversation in terms of skilled people, right? So can they recruit them or can they develop them internally? And obviously the pandemic, we haven't mentioned the words pandemic. It's probably the first time we've gone for 30 minutes on a call on one of these and haven't mentioned the pandemic for a while, but that was a massive game changer for obviously a lot of organizations, because not only did it change their workforce structure and where those people were, but it changed what business they were in sometimes as well. So how organizations really had to pivot. And we do a thing called, which is we call our HR realities research, which we're actually going to be formally announcing in a week or so. And one of the things that's really interesting is availability of skills has now appeared as #1 on the list of the organization's most significant business challenges. And that's the first time in the last, I think, 8-9 years we've run that something else has been ahead of increasing performance and profitability. So that's really a kind of very interesting point. So skills is a big topic, and it underpins actually most of the companies on here are trying to play into that debate in some way or another.
I think to answer the second question about what needs aren't being met by the skills market, I think one of the common thing, maybe there's two areas that I'd highlight. One is the interoperability of skills across systems. That is a common problem. I was hosting a panel conversation at Unleash just 3 or 4 weeks ago, and that came out as one of the headaches for people to try and understand, how do I connect the skills so it seamlessly touches every part of the employee journey, so that the skills that are used in recruitment are also the skills that are used in development, that are also used in feedback and performance management. And actually that continuity is not necessarily there. So that is a systemic challenge. I think the other thing that isn't necessarily being met by the skills market is a really good view of expertise. So the quality of skill is an area that they struggle with. And that's where things maybe become over-reliant on AI or over-reliant on individuals, trying to find that happy medium that says, this is somebody who can genuinely execute. And I think we're seeing some interesting evolution in that space from providers who are starting to go into where work happens, to understand how well it's happening, to then infer the quality of skill that's associated with that work as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add that's for me is still the biggest piece is if the measure of skill is an HR process, then in reality we've probably failed. So I mean, ultimately the biggest evidence of skill is what work you do, and I think or have done, and I think ultimately therefore we need to be able to bridge across into work rather than just being confined to HR processes and so on. But Martin, maybe we should move on.
Yeah, I'll come back to, there's a question from Ben about business value, which actually links into some of that. But I'd like to just return to Sergio's question about how do you imagine the future of talent mobility and in terms of where learning fits? You know, what does learning look like? I hope I've summarised this correctly, Sergio, but what does that look like in this new world of talent mobility, project and gig work?
So I'll take it because I'm sure David could run for hours on that. But let me just take it very quickly. So the important thing is, so talent mobility and talent marketplaces and opportunity marketplaces. So there's some interesting nuance around the differences between those things. But I think we see probably two lenses. We have organizations seeing talent marketplaces and so on as being around opportunities for development. So it tying very specifically into the question you put it. So ultimately, you know, one of the most effective ways of again, building capability, building skills and so on is to actually do stuff rather than actually just learning it from a you know, from a video or from an e-learning course or from even a classroom event. So I think there's a view of talent mobility and talent marketplace which relate to the development opportunity. There's also another view of that which is obviously relates to work. So for example, the moving across, David touched on gigs, for example, earlier, and you know, there's almost a work structural view which is moving away from allocating work to people bidding for work, right? And then potentially packaging that up in gigs as well. And that obviously then leads you across the third piece, which is cultural. And how that fits into the kind of work culture of an organization and so on. But I think what we're starting, you know, we're seeing talent marketplace solutions, for example, being both niche disruptive solutions on their own, but also being built out as part of wider development agendas and things like that as well. David?
And that's a really interesting point, because I think that we spoke about this a couple of years ago about, to some extent, learning platforms being disintermediated by by the talent management platforms to some extent, because they become a touch point for people to connect with their career thinking and their opportunity to increase their employability, their opportunity to do work. And that transparency of, oh, if you did this training, you'd be a more attractive candidate to be involved in that work, drives probably a stronger clarity of motivation to pick up and get involved in that learning. So I think that there are some really interesting things that actually there is some sort of real shaking out around the employee experience, which comes through these platforms. What I probably, just to try and summarize what you're saying here, my view is I think you start to switch into a sense of maybe learning sprints rather than learning programs. So what can you change as an individual in the next 2 to 3 weeks as part of a development journey? I think that turns into actually trying to support people to learn through work. So that means thinking about things like peer-to-peer coaching, the manager as coach, thinking about stretch assignments, thinking about how you provide support resources in order to get people ready, maybe connect them to mentors, and that's what lots of the talent mobility solutions will also do. So I think you start to focus around this sense of, you can think about career development as how can I build my employability within the organization, but also it's this sort of learning through work mentality of actually what can I do through performance management, performance support, peer-to-peer social recognition that enables me to develop my skills as I'm actually doing the work. And I think that's something that is, it moves you maybe into a maybe dispersed cohort, or actually maybe there aren't so many cohorts because everybody's on their own personalized journey.
And is this, I just, before I come to Ben's question, just in terms of hearing what you're both saying on this topic, is this a red flag for learning teams? What's happening in this space?
My own view is, I think, based on the scale and maturity of most learning teams, they are usually drowning under a tsunami of demand for business change. So new systems, new starters, new products, onboarding, there's loads of delivery to do. But if you want to be part of the strategic heartbeat of your organization, then you need to understand where it's going. You need to understand what work it needs to do in the future. And that invariably then boils down to what skills will empower the organization to be what it wants to be tomorrow. And if you're not involved in that conversation, you are going to continue to be the person who runs around like a madman, trying to make sure you deliver everything that you can possibly deliver, rather than taking a more strategic role and think about how you scale up through maybe more peer-to-peer based learning.
Great. Okay, so on to Ben's question about business value. So in this space then, what measures are you seeing major organizations using to define what success, value, ROI looks like? Is it the traditional measures of cost per hire, or are there new measures that you're seeing?
In our latest research, the top two measures of success are engagement and advocacy. So that's coming out of the employee listening tools, people like Culture Amp, Perceptics, Peakon, as a way of actually measuring employee engagement on the basis that if you understand somebody's engagement, then they're like, and you can improve that, then they're likely to improve their release of discretionary effort and work harder for you and want to stick around longer working for you as an organization. So engagement and advocacy tends to still be, or has emerged to be, the #1 HR measure of success. And the #2 item in our list that people rated was upskilling. So it's actually skills growth to keep pace with the change in the organization. Now, the challenge with both of those measures is they don't talk about outcomes. And in organizations that are potentially swimming themselves in loads of OKRs and KPIs, it probably is the gaping hole, the elephant in the room, of the lack of connection between our people intelligence and our business intelligence. And I think that's something that seems to be, I can think of one provider who's really focusing on that area, the guys at Visio, who are really trying to sort of play that hand, but others aren't necessarily so advanced. So I think actually the ROI, the value, the success aren't necessarily the most influential to the genuine stakeholders in the organization, your C-suite, who may be interested in like the tenure and people's engagement, but actually they're more interested in outcomes.
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that. And I think it's interesting. So most of the measures are still HR measures, is still probably the simple statement. And I think it's not sometimes for a lack of thinking. I mean, there's a lack of joining it up from a data and an analytics point of view. I think as we focus more on flow of work as well, there is something around how this impacts into productivity and work productivity, etc. But again, a lot of that's sort of difficult to measure. It's certainly easier in certain areas like frontline staff and so on. But it's harder in the internal facing roles in a big organization, right? So I think the point though is there is push. We see this pretty consistently, again, from a C-suite level, to be able to show more, not just correlation, but causation, I guess, from an outcomes perspective, and for the functions to step up and take more accountability for the impact that's being delivered, whether that's around business performance, whether it's around some kind of organizational capability measure to perform, or even agility of the business and so on and things like this. So these are difficult topics to attack, but ultimately they're sort of a bit non-negotiable now. And there is a risk, particularly as we automate more of these things and put more tech, not tech in the stack around it, that from a functional point of view, unless you can step up and be really seeing to be adding value, that you are at risk of being more marginalized in some ways as more and more of that happens. So I think it is that focus on outcomes and business values is very much at the heart of pretty much every piece of Fosway research we're looking at. Is don't just tell me about the hype around the trend, tell me what it delivers, right? And what is effective and what isn't. And I think that is still missing too much of the time.
Yeah, great, thank you. Now I'd like to go back to the grid in a minute and ask you a couple of questions about the grid. And please do, I mean, these are fantastic questions and it's a very interesting conversation. So please do share any more questions that you might have. I'm just thinking about the number of specialists here, and we talked about ecosystem as being on one of the key trends. So are you seeing, with all these new entrants and these specialists, how important does that become, and how healthy are the ecosystems now, or is there more work to be done there?
There's loads more work to be done there. I think part of the problem we've had, and I mean, skills in some ways is a good example, where everybody's trying to grab it. Nobody really wants to share or play nice. As David said earlier, I mean, the skills and also the AI pieces in every vendor roadmap. So they're all, in some ways that problem is getting worse. What I think we are starting to see is organizations that maybe are being more, they've worked out they've got to connect the model and connect this thing. So we have when we did a project a couple of years ago where we were trying to blow up this sort of general talk around experience and trying to understand what really underpinned it. And some of these themes we're talking about were very much part of that. But one of the other one was what we call ecosystemness. So the vendors will talk about interoperability and standards and APIs and, open architectures and all these kind of technical terms. But ultimately, how well you play in the wider ecosystem, as the slide said earlier, think ecosystem, not system, right? It's always an ecosystem, even if you have a big HCM suite as the anchor pillar for that. And HCM has definitely dragged a lot of the talent conversation into it. But ultimately, it's always an ecosystem that you're trying to put together. And often it's an ecosystem of ecosystems as well, right? Because you go into TA is an ecosystem, learning is an ecosystem. If you're a multinational, you've got a diversity of payrolls providers and everything else as well. So you get a lot of fragmentation. And I think what we're starting to see is the ability to play well across that ecosystem is a differentiating characteristic. Some of the vendors really get that, and that's a key part of their strategy. And it's not just a question of saying, I've got APIs, you can connect as I've got APIs, you can connect things, because most customers just don't want to build integrations. Integrations are very expensive things to build and maintain. So if you're able to really function effectively across a wider ecosystem, if you've got a lot more pre-built connectors that give you flexibility to work in different, with different systems in different parts of the world or whatever it is, this is a huge advantage from a vendor perspective, and from a customer point of view, it's a kind of game changer. Even for the largest enterprises, it's a real drag on their ability to change if they can't do that. So I think that whole thing around the rise of specialists, the way that they fit into the wider HR ecosystem, but also the way they fit together, has become a really a strongly differentiating characteristic.
I think the only thing I'd add to that is, I think to some extent the talent management solutions marketplace, just overall, probably over the last, if you went back to 2005, I think it had significantly stagnated in terms of the genuine innovation that had been brought to market. And we started probably to see a significant level of disruption, for example, in the early days with Glow, who started to bring this sense of a talent marketplace to play in about 2016. And actually, it's been the innovators who've been able to effectively respond to changes in expectations from buyers around what they want from their solutions. And they've probably done that with greater passion, energy, and agility than some of the more established incumbent players who are now to some extent playing catch up. And that's one of the reasons probably why there are some of these niche players, because organizations, the buyers, were looking at the market space. Well, I want to be able to enhance my ability to manage global mobility within my organization. Where can I find that? And actually, it cost them a fortune to use external aggregators to put in manual processes, and it was awful. So actually, you get this sort of bubbling up of a specialist expertise. I think they also then looked at how can I create a more fluid and dynamic organization that doesn't just rely on roles and responsibilities. Actually, that started this sort of growth around the opportunity market space. How can I connect people and retain my talent better by helping them understand where the career pathways are in my organization without actually having to create specific career pathways that people work their way through? And that led to opportunity marketplaces. I think there's been, to some extent, the talent management solutions of the past sort of resting on their laurels a bit. And I think they've been caught out and overtaken. And we'll see that rebalancing probably over the next 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to come to Sergio's asked another question, but I thought while we've got the grid up on screen, is there anything else you would add in terms of what the overall shape of that grid tells us about the market that you haven't already picked up on?
Yeah, there's a strong movement to up and right? And I think that's reflective of the level of innovation, the speed to success for many of the solutions as well, being something that's easier to realize potentially than a large HCM rollout, which takes more time. So the ability to realize value faster. And because they tend to be more niche solutions typically, because they are specialists, their ability to create stronger relationships with their clients and evolve faster, I think that creates an element of stronger client advocacy. And the only other thing I'd add to that is actually what lots of the niche players start to bring is not just the expertise around the solution, but the expertise around the execution of doing something new. And it's navigating the change and doing that change well and fast, which is a bigger differentiator as the system itself.
I think the other thing I would add is that we could easily make it 3 times bigger in terms of the number of vendors we include and so on. This is always a bit of a battle, and there are a lot of new entrants in terms of disruptive players that are, and some of those are on a fairly high growth trajectory. Many of them were raising money from private equity and so on, and on a higher growth trajectory. And they continue to largely set the agenda that ultimately I think the talent suites off trying to follow, but also to some degree the HCM suites as well. And if you go along to any of the big trade shows, you can see where the high burn rate is, right? Where there's companies that are really investing and trying to build trajectory. The other thing is I just going to touch on around, which is there's always a lot of noise around experience, right? So I'm going to make a statement which is kind of slightly controversial, but a lot of vendors will talk about talent experience, and a lot of vendors are trying to be the talent experience platform for the market as well. And I think that's a really tough position to take, not because experience is not important, but because experience is so intimately associated with the disruption capability, the area of talent you're talking about. So there's a really big, we've got people experience and employee experience, and then talent experience, and then learning experience and things like this. I think some of these things are played better on slideware than they do in reality. But what we're seeing is a big shift, because ultimately what we want is the experience people have around talent processes to be much slicker and more disruptive. So you've kind of got this dual narrative. Is this a separate thing, or is it actually part of everything else? At the end of the day, this is an area where we're seeing, as I think it was on this previous slide, that skills and experience pretty much are driving the whole of the change agenda. Yeah.
Okay, so we've got one last question from Sergio again, just about the interoperability. Because of what you've said, is there a need for a vendor agnostic third-party kind of way of connecting the ecosystem?
Need is an interesting word, right? I think there are people trying to play that role. There's also other angles to this. I mean, that, for example, there's been quite a lot of work done in some organizations like Velocity Network looking at blockchain and how it could be used. There's real questions around authentication of skills and capability across the network and so on. I think there will be a role for some of those. I think at the end of the day, what it's more important is that vendors understand, even the really big ones, about how they play in that wider ecosystem story. However much they might want to be an anchor suite or an anchor solutions, they have to also play nice. They don't necessarily have the most accurate view of these things. And large customers particularly, when we look at large enterprise organizations, many of those have already bought talent marketplaces, bought learning experience platforms, have multiple LMSs, have multiple, they have an HCM suite, but they also have talent applications. They have a lot of complexity. They are typically looking to simplify where they can, but they're also not looking to simplify and screw up the value add that they're getting from some of these things as well. So in some ways, the pressure is to innovate faster, as well as and be more impactful, deliver higher outcome, at the same time that maybe the IT function is also trying to simplify and connect together. So I'm not convinced that it's about a third-party standards or interoperability body coming along. I mean, these organizations already exist to some degree, but they're not, I would say, that influential ultimately in the buying decisions of organizations. It tends to be more based on, their kind of anchor suite assumptions, their and vendor alliances, and also overall architectural view that they have. Rather than necessarily a kind of third-party standards organizations or interoperability set standards or so on.
David,
I wouldn't add anything to that. I think that's hit the nail on the head. So
okay.
I don't think there's anything to add, to be honest.
Okay.
There is a very interesting point though, which is not so much to do with TPS, but also the wider cloud HR, which is there is a very different point of view here. When you look at, for example, Workday, and the way that it tends to want to pull people towards that versus maybe SAP with a more of an open space. Interestingly, I was at Cornerstone Convergence in the States a couple of weeks ago, and they've just announced what they call their intelligent tech fabric, which is where their skills intelligence and content intelligence layer, really focusing on basically opening that up to a wider space. And also you've got companies like Eightfold here, for example, which are being used to drive that skills intelligence story across the employee lifecycle for a lot of companies, very much then thinking about almost being the fabric that can connect into a lot of the other applications. So, the risk is if you don't add the pieces together, right, you just end up with a lot of overlapping functionality. And you actually haven't got the best view of anything, right? Because you've only got a partial view. If you've got different AI machine learning engines looking at skills, for example, they only look at it based on the scope of what they see.
Okay, so we're going to wrap it up, but I've got one last question, which I always like to ask on our RC Analyst sessions, which is, where's the hype? So where's the hype in talent and people success currently?
Without wanting to be a broken record, because I think we've said this before on other Ask the Analyst sessions, it invariably comes down to the AI and the quality of the AI. There are lots of promises made. How complete the picture really is dependent probably on your context as much as it is in the environment. But there's some really amazing stretches and advances that are being made. So whilst it's a lot of the hype, it's also a lot of the promise, and it's being proven bit by bit with some really quite impressive results for large organizations as well. So it's a two-edged sword, maybe.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would go back to is there's always a lot of hype where there's always a lot of hot topic, right? So skills and experience and AI are all really, they're very overtraded in lots of ways. I mean, it's not because they're not important and they're not fundamental actually to what we're trying to do, but therefore there's also potential where everybody's trying to claim they have it, whereas often they don't necessarily. And I think that so always look for where the biggest heat is. You can always also expect to see some of the most hype as well, to some degree. And I also think the other thing is that the comment that David talked about before was a lot of the agenda here has been set by the disruptors, by the specialists. And I think a lot of the suites are following, you know, and are following suit and building out capability, but also some of that capability is also kind of, it's behind the curve, right? They're playing catch up. And I think there are real questions for companies that maybe just assume that they're going to turn off some of these solutions because their HCM suite is going to do this. Actually might find that there's still quite a big reality gap between those two things, and that the price they pay for simplification is ultimately they lose the value from that function. It's really interesting when you look at some of these niche cases, the value that can be delivered is really high. And therefore, you know, the question is, are you prepared to put that at risk? Is good enough really good enough when it comes down to making the decision to turn some of them off? So yeah, I think that's the other thing to sort of bear in mind, is there is a reality gap here around where the vendors are, and also obviously the key thing about the innovators and the specialists is they're innovating even faster, right? So sometimes the gap is growing, not declining.
Great, thank you. Well, look, we're going to bring this to an end. We said we would end at 4 o'clock, although I obviously said it would be 3 o'clock earlier. So I'd just like to thank both our Davids, David Wilson and David Perring, for sharing their thoughts and insights. So really, really useful and interesting. So thank you both. And I'd also like to thank everyone who's participated today, who's been here today and who's asked questions. That's always makes this such a useful event. And before we end, I'd just like to quickly bring us back to, you know, what we do here at Fosway. You know, this really is a vast kind of research machine, really. And as David was saying, that, you know, we talk to so many vendors, with so many corporates, and, you know, we would just invite you to take a closer look at some of the research that we produce. And from our work, we typically see that you know, we can really reduce the time it takes to validate shortlists, and to really help make better decisions, because in this space there are, you know, the chance of making good buying decisions isn't as great as we'd probably like to think. So just next slide, please. So you can access our report at the Talent and People Success 9-grid report. Remember, it is a report, not just the grid, so there's lots of interesting solution and market trends in there. And you can look at all the other reports for all the areas that we cover. And finally, don't forget that we also have all our research in French and German too. So just on the homepage of the website on the left, you'll see the option to choose English, French and German. And I think that's it, isn't it? It is indeed. There we go. I was racing ahead of our final slide. So thank you, everyone. I think that brings us up to just 1 minute past 4. So pretty much on time. Thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at our next session. Thank you.